There is a conversation I have been afraid to have publicly for a very long time. Not because I do not know the answer, but because the answer overturns almost everything that well-meaning religious people have been taught since childhood. Here it is. The wealthiest people I have ever encountered in my 4 decades of rabbinical study, men and women who built dynasties across continents, whose names appear on institutions, whose grandchildren's grandchildren will never worry about money. Not one of them, in all my years of sitting beside them, prayed the way you are probably praying right now. And the moment I tell people this, the room goes quiet in a very specific way. A silence that is not peaceful. A silence that is afraid. Good. Stay in that discomfort for a moment. That discomfort is the doorway. My name is not important. What is important is what I have spent my life accumulating, not in bank accounts, but in understanding. I studied under a master named Reb Zalafachad, a man who spoke 6 languages, and whose closest students included some of the most quietly powerful financiers of the 20th century. I traveled to yeshivas in places most people cannot find on a map. I sat in private studies surrounded by manuscripts that have never been digitized, annotated by hands that have been in the ground for 300 years. And the thread that ran through all of it, the single most consistent teaching across every school of thought, every tradition, every interpretation, was this: the universe does not respond to requests. It responds to resonance. Let that land. The universe does not respond to requests. It responds to resonance. I want to tell you about a man I will call Eliphaz. He was a textile merchant in his 50s when I first met him. 3rd-generation wealth, soft-spoken, the kind of man who remembered the names of waiters and tipped with an almost ceremonial generosity. I asked him once over a long Shabbat dinner what he prayed for. He looked at me with the expression of someone who had been waiting years to be asked that question properly. He said, "I never pray for the destination. I pray for the navigation." I have been unpacking that sentence ever since. Most people come to prayer the way they come to a vending machine. They insert their plea, they press the button, they wait. When nothing falls out, they either press harder, more urgency, more desperation, longer prayers, more tears, or they walk away convinced the machine is broken, that the machine in this case is God, that God has somehow failed them, overlooked them, chosen someone else. But here is what 40 years in these texts has taught me. The machine is not broken. The approach is. When the Talmudic sage Reb Nehuniah ben Hakana was asked the secret of his longevity and prosperity, he did not speak about charity or Shabbat observance, though he valued both. He spoke about a single discipline, a discipline of mind that he called Haksharat HaMekabel, the preparation of the receiver. He said that most people are like cisterns with cracks in the floor. They beg heaven to pour water into them and cannot understand why they remain dry. But the water is pouring. It is always pouring. The problem is structural. The problem is inside the vessel. I remember the first time I encountered genuine, inherited, multi-generational wealth up close. I was 29 years old, recently ordained, invited to speak at a private gathering in a home that I later learned had been in the same family for 6 generations. The patriarch of the family, a man named Yedidia, was 91 years old, sharp as a straight razor, and utterly unimpressed by everything around him except books and grandchildren. I sat beside him for almost 2 hours before he said a single word to me. When he finally turned and spoke, he said this: "Young Rabbi, do you know what poor people and rich people have in common?" I said I did not. He said, "They both pray. The difference is what they pray for." I asked him what he prayed for. He looked at me for a very long moment. Then he said, "I pray that I do not make a fool of myself." I laughed. He did not. He meant it completely. What Yedidia understood, what every genuinely wealthy person I have studied alongside has understood in one form or another, is that the enemy of prosperity is not scarcity. The enemy of prosperity is misalignment. And the most dangerous form of misalignment is the pride of a person who thinks they already know what they need. When you pray for money, you are telling the universe, "I know exactly what my problem is. I know exactly what the solution looks like, and I need you to deliver it in this specific form on my schedule." That is not prayer. That is a purchase order. And the universe is not a fulfillment warehouse. The ancient Kabbalistic masters wrote about a concept they called tzimtzum, a deliberate contraction, a withdrawal, not as punishment, but as an act of love that creates space for the receiver to participate in their own expansion. The mystic Reb Amitai of the Cordovero school wrote that the greatest spiritual poverty is not the absence of money, but the absence of the capacity to hold what is given. Let me be specific now. Because I have spent the first part of this conversation tearing down a flawed architecture, and now I want to give you something to build with. There are 5 orientations. I will not call them prayers exactly, though prayer is their container, that I have observed consistently across decades of studying wealthy Jewish families, successful entrepreneurs, builders of legacies. Not one of these orientations mentions money. Not one asks for financial rescue. Every single one is concerned with something deeper, something upstream, because upstream is where everything is decided. The first orientation is a prayer for discernment in the face of confusion. Not wisdom in the abstract, bumper sticker sense. Discernment, the specific capacity to look at a complicated situation, a business decision, a relationship, a fork in the road, and perceive the actual structure of what is happening, rather than the story your emotions are telling you about it. The Talmud records a conversation between 2 sages, arguing about the nature of divine guidance. One sage insisted that God guides the righteous away from danger. The other pushed back and said, "No, God gives the righteous the eyes to see danger themselves." The first sage fell silent for a long time and then said, "That is a harder gift and a greater one." Every morning, before the day has had a chance to assert its demands, the wealthy people I have known practice a form of internal silence, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 20, during which they ask with genuine sincerity to see clearly, not to be protected from difficulty, to see it coming early enough to respond rather than react. There is a prayer attributed to Reb Tzadok HaKohen that I have used almost every morning for 30 years. I have adapted it from the original Aramaic, and I will share it with you now. May I not be fooled by the surface of things today. May I be given the patience to wait for clarity before I act. May the noise of my own wanting not drown out what I am actually being shown. Say that every morning. Mean it, and pay attention to what begins to change. The second orientation is a prayer for the right measure of fear. This one surprises people. We live in a culture that has declared war on fear, that treats fear as the enemy of abundance, that plasters motivational slogans over the doorways of its meditation apps, insisting that fear is a liar and courage is everything. The Jewish tradition is more nuanced and more honest. Reb Yishmael, in the 2nd century, taught that a person without any fear is not free, they are reckless. The fear he was describing was not the paralytic, shrinking kind. He was describing yirat chet, a precise, calibrated awareness of consequence. The wealthy merchants and financiers I have known were almost universally more afraid than the people around them. But their fear was pointed in a very specific direction, toward mistakes, toward hubris, toward the particular catastrophe that comes from moving too fast and listening too little. They did not pray to be made fearless. They prayed to be made appropriately afraid of the right things. There is a school of thought in modern finance that talks about risk management as though it were purely a mathematical exercise. But the greatest investors in history, the ones who built wealth across generations, understood risk as a spiritual discipline first. They were afraid of overconfidence. They were afraid of the moment when success begins to breed the assumption that success is guaranteed. They prayed, in various ways and languages, to be kept humble enough to keep learning. The third orientation is a prayer for invisible protection over existing abundance. This one runs counter to almost everything the prosperity gospel tradition teaches. The tradition I was raised in does not say, ask for more, ask always for more. It says, first protect what has been given. First demonstrate that you are a trustworthy steward of what is already in your hands. The Kabbalistic concept here is Shmirat HaNefesh, a guardianship of the self and its resources that extends beyond the merely physical. You are not only protecting your savings or your business relationships, you are protecting the clarity of your intention, the integrity of your reputation, the quality of your attention. I knew a woman, a partner in a significant real estate concern, who had a practice she called her nightly accounting. Every evening before sleep, she would review the day, not in terms of what she had gained, but in terms of what she had guarded. Had she spoken carelessly about someone's vulnerability? Had she made a commitment she was not fully prepared to keep? Had she been less precise than the situation required? She was not searching for reasons to feel guilty. She was running what she called a spiritual audit. She believed, and I believe she was right, that small erosions of integrity are the hairline fractures through which large fortunes eventually collapse. She prayed not to be given more until she could demonstrate she was taking proper care of what she already had. The fourth orientation is a prayer for the capacity to be genuinely useful. I want to say something that may be uncomfortable. A great deal of modern spiritual and self-help culture has turned prosperity into a fundamentally self-referential project. The question is always, what can I attract? What can I manifest? What can I receive? How do I get mine? Even the language of alignment and frequency is almost always pointed inward and upward, toward the self and toward the accumulation of things for the self. The Jewish tradition at its deepest is suspicious of this, not because wanting things is wrong, but because a self that is only oriented toward its own expansion is spiritually impoverished in a way that no amount of money can cure. Reb Pinchas of Koretz, one of the early Hasidic masters, said something that I have spent years meditating on. He said, "The person who is always asking what they will receive has already decided they have nothing to give, and the universe treats them accordingly." The wealthiest people I have known, not the flashiest, but the ones whose wealth was real, rooted, self-replenishing, prayed, in various ways, to be made genuinely useful. Not useful in the sense of being available to be exploited. Useful in the sense of having something real to contribute. They asked to be given problems they were capable of solving. They asked to be sent people whose situations their particular capacities could actually address. There is a reason that almost every major Jewish philanthropic institution was built not by people who prayed to receive, but by people who prayed to give. Giving in this tradition is not charity in the pitying sense. It is the demonstration of surplus. And surplus is the natural result of a person who has learned to be genuinely, specifically, practically useful. The fifth orientation is a prayer for patience with the timing of things. If I had to identify the single most common spiritual error I have witnessed in 40 years of rabbinical work, it would be this. People who receive a genuine answer to a genuine prayer, but abandon it 3 days before the answer arrives. The Talmud tells a story, and I am reconstructing the shape of it rather than quoting it, about a man who digs for water in a field and stops 3 feet before the underground spring. He walks away convinced there is no water. The next man to walk through, knowing nothing about the digging that came before, strikes the spring within minutes. Timing is not indifference. The delay is not evidence that the answer is not coming. In almost every case, in my experience, the delay is structural. The person asking is not yet in the condition to properly receive what they are asking for. The preparation is still in progress. The vessel is still being shaped. Reb Avigdor, a contemporary teacher whose work I have studied for 2 decades, describes this as teshuvat hazman, the response of time itself. He argues that time is not a neutral medium in which events happen. Time is an active participant in the unfolding of a person's life. When the timing seems wrong, it is worth asking not, why is this delayed, but what is still being built in me that needs to be finished before this can arrive? Praying for patience with divine timing is not passive. It is not resignation. It is the most active and demanding spiritual discipline I know. It requires holding steady in a state of faithful expectancy. Not the desperate, white-knuckled variety, but the quiet, grounded confidence of someone who has planted seeds and has no anxiety about whether the season will turn. Now I want to address something directly, because I have been in enough conversations to know what some of you are thinking right now. You are thinking, this is beautiful, this is philosophical, but I have rent due. I have a family to feed. I do not have the luxury of praying for discernment and patience when the numbers in my bank account are frightening. I hear that. I have sat across from people in that exact situation. And what I am about to say is not cold comfort. It is the most practical thing I know. The orientation of your prayer reorganizes the orientation of your attention. And the orientation of your attention determines what you are capable of noticing. A person praying from panic is searching the horizon for rescue. A person praying for discernment is examining the immediate environment for overlooked structure. These are completely different modes of perception, and they produce completely different results in the same set of circumstances. Reb Elazar of Worms, writing in the 12th century, made an observation that I consider one of the most practically important in all of rabbinic literature. He wrote that the person in crisis who can bring themselves to pray for clarity rather than relief will almost always find within a short time that relief was available to them all along. It was simply invisible from the angle of panic. I have tested this. I have watched hundreds of people test it. It is true. The shift from "God, fix this" to "God, let me see what I am missing" is not a grammatical revision. It is a fundamental reorientation of the self toward its situation. And that reorientation changes everything downstream. I want to give you a practice, something concrete, something that takes less than 10 minutes and can be done before the rest of the world makes its claims on your morning. Sit in silence for 2 minutes, not the silence of a cleared mind. That is not accessible to most people in the middle of financial stress, and you should not demand it of yourself. Just 2 minutes of not speaking, not moving, not consuming anything. Let the noise settle to the degree that it can. Then speak, aloud if possible, something along these lines, in your own words, in your own voice, because your own words carry more of your frequency than borrowed ones. I am not asking for rescue today. I am asking for clarity. I am asking to see what I am standing next to, that I have been too afraid or too rushed to examine. I am asking for the right people to find their way into my path. I am asking to be useful in a way that I have not yet understood how to be. And I am asking for the patience to trust the shape of time, even when the shape is not the one I would have chosen. That is it. That is the whole practice. Do it every morning for 30 consecutive days. Not 30 days when you feel like it. 30 consecutive days. The consistency is not superstition. Consistency is what transforms an insight into an architecture. You are building something in yourself, and buildings require uninterrupted days. The tradition I carry does not promise you a specific number in your bank account. Anyone who makes you that promise in the name of ancient wisdom is selling you something other than wisdom. What it promises, and what I have watched it deliver reliably, across a career spent close to both poverty and extraordinary wealth, is a reorientation so fundamental that the circumstances of your financial life cannot help but respond to it. Not because the universe is a reward machine, but because your capacity to perceive, to act, to relate, to build, to give, and to receive are all functions of who you are being. And who you are being is the one thing that prayer, practiced with sincerity and intelligence, can actually change. Yedidia, the 91-year-old patriarch who told me that wealthy people and poor people both pray, lived another 4 years after our conversation. I attended his funeral. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled 3 rows. One of his granddaughters, a doctor, gave the eulogy. She said that he had given each of his children one piece of advice when they came of age. Not advice about investments or business. One sentence, the same sentence to every one of them. She paused. The room was absolutely still. She said, "He told each of them, pray to see clearly because everything else follows from that." The room exhaled. Everything else follows from that. You have been given in this conversation 5 orientations that the wealthiest people I have known have practiced, in various forms, across the whole of their financial lives. Discernment over noise, calibrated fear over reckless confidence, guardianship of what exists over perpetual grasping for more, usefulness over acquisition, patience with time over demands on time. None of these are prayers for money. All of them, practiced with consistency and sincerity, create the conditions in which money, and more importantly the life that money is supposed to support, becomes possible in a way it simply cannot become possible from any other starting point. The decision you make in the next 24 hours about whether to begin this practice is itself a kind of prayer. What you decide to do with this information will tell you something about the current state of your vessel, whether it is ready to receive or whether it still has cracks that need attending. I am not your judge. I am simply someone who has been in these rooms, read these texts, sat beside these lives, and is reporting what I have seen. Begin tomorrow morning. Begin with silence. Begin with the request to see. That is where every lasting thing begins.